Hi, Will. I hope you're doing well. Congratulations again on the favorable ruling by the Teachers Association. I'm very happy to hear that they made the right decision. This video is a response to the one you published entitled What Schools Don't Tell You About Climate Change. First off, I just want to say I strongly agree that the hysteria surrounding climate change has done so much to actually hinder genuine efforts to tackle the problem. But this video is just focused on your statements about the climate science. And I will offer what I think are I'll address some points that I think you made in the video that might be incorrect. So with that said, I wanted to start with the relationship between CO2 and temperature, specifically the points that you addressed in your video. Does CO2 correlate with temperature? Does CO2 cause changes in temperature? And what's the evidence? Well, in your video, you started by saying,
and there is very little correlation between the estimates of CO2 and the Earth's temperature over the past 550 million years anyway.
Here's what I think is the problem with the graph you've shown. It's basically the sum of two other graphs. Here's the first one by Christopher Scottis, and here's the second by Robert Berner. The first shows temperature and the second shows CO2, and putting them together, this is the result you get. I don't think that's appropriate because you might be missing the effect of other variables. Here's another example. If you consider the temperature in your house and the output of your heater and try to plot the two, it's likely you won't see much correlation throughout the year at all because you're missing the vital effect of the weather outside. In this case, in the case of global temperatures, that's the sun. When you do take into account both the effect of CO2 and the sun, you see an excellent correlation over that period of time. That doesn't mean that the sun is more important than CO2 or vice versa. It just means that you have to take into account the effect of both in this system, which could be the effect of the sun alone, or the effect of CO2 alone, or the effect of both together. Which leads into your next point about the medieval warm period.
There is no evidence for a significant increase of CO2 in the medieval warm period, nor for a significant decrease at the time of the subsequent Little Ice Age.
I agree that CO2 is probably not the cause of the medieval warm period, as do many scientists, but during that same period, if you look at the solar irradiance, and that is the solar output, you can see it is much higher than it was just before the Ice Age that accompanied the medieval warm period, which is roughly 950 to 1200 AD. And further to that point, using this same graph, you can see that soon after the medieval warm period and the high solar output, there's a period of low solar output, which matches up really well with the mini Ice Age that occurred after the warm period, which is roughly between 1420 and 1860. The next point is, does CO2 actually cause changes in global temperature, and what's the evidence? As you have stated,
correlation is not causation.
And I agree. But as we have seen, global temperatures depend on both CO2 and the sun. During the medieval warm period and following Ice Age, CO2 stayed roughly constant and the sun's output changed. Hence we can say that the sun largely caused that change in temperature. But during the Pleistocene epoch, when the sun stayed roughly constant and atmospheric CO2 rose by 1,900 parts per million, this contributed 1 to 1.5 degrees of further global warming. Hence we can say that CO2 largely caused this change in temperature, and the change that we are currently experiencing, since the sun over the last few decades has actually been gradually getting weaker.
It is not even clear that human activity is the main factor in increased CO2 levels.
But measurements of atmospheric CO2 clearly show it increasing since the start of the Industrial Revolution. But how can we be sure that this is caused by human activity? Well, one way is to look at the amount of one type of carbon, known as carbon-12. Burning fossil fuels releases more carbon-12 into the atmosphere, while the amounts of carbon-13 and 14 stay roughly the same. This graph shows the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. As the amount of carbon-12 goes up, the ratio goes down, hence proving that burning fossil fuels is indeed the main factor driving the rise in CO2 levels recently. And regarding your comment on the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events.
But what about extreme weather events? They have either not changed or have decreased alongside the recent rise in CO2 levels.
Climate science has actually made several predictions that came true about extreme weather. More cyclones will reach high categories, more extreme rainfall events, and more flooding as a result, and an increased risk of wildfires.
And polar bears. There are more today than there were 30 years ago.
Polar bear numbers only seem to increase, mainly because we can count them better now than we did in the past, but also because there has been concerted efforts to protect them. Early reports in the 1950s are unreliable because surveyors couldn't navigate harsh terrain well. They didn't keep strict records and had difficulty tracking polar bears who crossed borders frequently and lived in sparsely populated habitats. Professional surveyors today can use thermal and satellite imaging, and they have learned how to deal better with the challenges posed by the terrain. Hence, it is hard to say what has or has not happened to polar bear numbers for the last 30 years. And finally, on your statement about the IPCC's report.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, simply removed the medieval warming period and Little Ice Age from its 2001 report. If the facts don't fit the theory, the facts have to go.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by this, but I've heard a similar idea that the IPCC report, published in 1990, showed the medieval warm period prominently, but the 2001 report seems to have airbrushed it out. If this isn't what you are referring to, please correct me. But if it is, there are a few things to note. First, the graph from the 1990 IPCC report ends in 1950 and does not include the recent temperature rise. And second, it isn't clear if this graph represents local or global temperatures. This is relevant because local temperatures can differ markedly from the global average. Moreover, since 1990, further studies have been conducted, the data has been refined, and now this graph includes recent global temperatures and those refinements. Since the recent temperature rise dwarfs the warming during the medieval warm period, it is obvious that the latter won't feature as prominently. This is how science works. With more data comes greater accuracy.